The year was 2011. Volkswagen sold nearly one out of every three cars it produced directly into the Chinese market. By the mid-2020s, that share had not only endured, but expanded. On the surface, it seems like an industrial triumph. Yet beneath that success lies a structural tension quietly reshaping Europe's largest economy. German multinationals are not retreating from China. Instead, they are rewiring their supply chains within China itself, a strategy that insulates them from global disruption, but in doing so creates new dependencies and vulnerabilities. The question is not whether this works, it does. The question is, what kind of leverage are they building and at what cost? Most people think of supply chains as logistics networks, trucks, ports, factories moving goods around the globe. In that view, geopolitical risk is measured in tariffs, sanctions, and trade wars. Disruptions appear headline-driven, sudden, and solvable with policy levers. That perspective is logical, but it is incomplete. It misses the invisible architecture, ownership structures, long-term contracts, local ecosystems, and embedded dependencies. These are the arteries through which global commerce flows, and once built, they resist change. The common narrative goes like this. German firms want to de-risk their exposure to China. Berlin's official language even phrases it carefully, de-risking, not decoupling. But what firms actually do tells a different story. They are accumulating presence, entrenching operations, and building leverage inside China's industrial heartlands. And that leverage will shape the next decade. To understand this hidden architecture, we start with Volkswagen. Its joint ventures in China are not peripheral. They are central to its global strategy. In 2025, German investments in China rose to over $7 billion, more than a 55% jump from 2 years earlier. By contrast, German investment in the US fell nearly in half. 1 in 6 Volkswagen employees now works in China, and nearly 16% of DAX firms' revenues come from that market. This is accumulation, slowly building arteries that connect Germany's industrial heart to China's burgeoning consumer and manufacturing ecosystem. It began in the 1990s and 2000s, driven by cost savings and access to an enormous market. At first, these investments seemed tactical, produce cheaper cars, gain market share, but over decades, these arteries became primary circulation pathways. Severing them now would be painful, disruptive, and costly. Think of accumulation like river channels forming over centuries. Water finds the path of least resistance. Once sediment builds up, the river cannot easily change course. German multinationals have created such entrenched channels in China. Assembly plants, supplier networks, R&D facilities, and specialized labor pools. Each one is a tributary that strengthens the industrial delta. The second stage is entrenchment. German firms have done more than set up factories. They've restructured their supply chains around China itself. Contracts lock them into Chinese suppliers. Intellectual property is embedded in local R&D labs. Logistics are tied to regional distribution networks. Production is no longer just in China for China as a hedge against trade barriers. It is now core to global output. Imagine a river delta again, but now with dams, locks, and canals carefully engineered. Water can flow efficiently, but moving the flow elsewhere requires rebuilding the entire system. That is entrenchment. Volkswagen's batteries are produced in Suzhou. BMW sources electronics from Guangdong. Chemical components flow from Shanghai-based partners. Retraining labor, requalifying suppliers, renegotiating contracts. These are multi-year, multi-billion-dollar processes. The channels have hardened. This entrenchment generates stability, yes, but also dependency. Firms gain operational resilience against tariffs or sanctions, but they also rely on China's power grids, ports, and rare earth supply chains. The deeper they embed, the harder it becomes to withdraw. This brings us to leverage, the stage where structural mechanics meet strategy. By embedding production in China, German firms reduce dependence on cross-border logistics and global disruptions, yet leverage is double-edged. Localizing production creates nodes that are strategically insulated, but also nodes that are geopolitically sensitive. According to Germany's Bundesbank, Nearly half of German manufacturers source critical intermediate inputs directly or indirectly from China, particularly batteries, energy storage, and specialized chemical components. One wrong policy move, one diplomatic flare up, and the system feels pressure, not through tariffs, but through choke points embedded in contracts, ecosystems, and infrastructure. Visualize it as an electrical grid. Germany's firms have built parallel circuits across regions, but they've also wired high voltage lines directly into China's industrial hubs. Capacity is higher, reliability is improved. But if that hub fails or is pressured externally, the network cannot reroute instantly. The redundancy exists, but the hub itself becomes a point of strategic friction. History repeats this pattern. Japanese automakers in the 1980s localized production in North America to bypass quotas. US electronics firms in East Asia during the 2000s built assembly hubs to cut costs. Initially, these were risk mitigation tactics. Decades later, these localized networks became structural leverage, not optional add-ons. Germany's current situation is the same, only magnified by China's centrality in global industrial flows. The unresolved tension is clear. Can German multinationals maintain strategic flexibility while deeply embedded in China's industrial ecosystem? Or will their very strategy of mitigation become a form of dependence? Supply chains are architectures of leverage, shaped by decades of accumulation, entrenchment, and risk. Altering them requires time, capital, and the willingness to endure inefficiencies. Germany's industrial networks now stand at a threshold, embodying both the promise of global integration and the tension of entrenched dependencies. While German multinationals have built deep arteries into China, the Chinese state has simultaneously orchestrated its own strategic architecture, leveraging manufacturing, rare earth supply, and industrial ecosystems to shape global flows. China's playbook is deceptively simple: accumulate capacity, entrench ecosystems, and leverage choke points. The state invests in raw material extraction, processing, and advanced manufacturing simultaneously. Rare earths, lithium, cobalt, these are not just commodities, but nodes of structural leverage. By controlling processing capacity, China can influence prices, technology access, and industrial timelines globally. Consider neodymium, a rare earth critical for EV motors and wind turbines. China controls nearly 90% of processing capacity. Ownership of the mine is secondary. The choke points are in refining and conversion, the high-value nodes. Global automakers may own raw ore elsewhere, but without Chinese processing, the supply chain remains incomplete. Germany, the US, Japan, they all face the same structural constraint. China's strategy mirrors the same three stages of industrial architecture. Accumulation, massive investment in mines, refineries, factories. For example, the Jiangxi and Inner Mongolia regions house dozens of state-backed processing facilities, purpose-built for both domestic use and export. Entrenchment, integrated supply chains link extraction, refinement, component manufacturing, and assembly. IP transfer occurs via joint ventures, R&D centers, and engineering partnerships. Outsiders embed themselves within these systems to access technology, further entrenching their dependence. Leverage. China retains influence over global production flows, even without formal restrictions. Export policies, contract terms, and infrastructure access create soft control. A signaling of potential disruption can influence investment, pricing, and strategic planning worldwide. China's industrial leverage is not exercised aggressively every day. It is quiet, structural, and systemic. For Germany, the US, and other industrial powers, the question is not whether China could constrain flows, but how firms and governments respond to embedded dependencies. Firms diversify. India, Vietnam, Mexico, new hubs emerge. But these alternatives are still supplementary, not primary. Germany's industrial delta continues to rely on China as a backbone. Supply chains have momentum, capital, contracts, and labor pipelines cannot be rewritten instantly. Economists describe this as lock-in. Strategic choices accumulate into systemic constraints. A multinational may want flexibility, but decades of investment, talent training, and contractual commitments bind them to the system they once sought to hedge. China's leverage is both direct, through material control, and indirect, through embedded industrial ecosystems. Lessons from history and analogies. History provides context. The British Empire controlled rubber and tea through colonies, shipping networks, and plantations. US wartime synthetic rubber initiatives took years to replicate what global markets had optimized away. Rare earths, batteries, and EV supply chains today are no different. Think of global supply chains as tectonic plates. Investment and contracts are pressure points. Governments and firms can nudge them, diversify flows, or build redundancy. But seismic shifts take time, and the stress accumulates silently beneath the surface. The consequences ripple across politics, economics, and industry. Policy. Geopolitical decisions must account for industrial dependencies that cannot be rapidly altered. Markets. Price volatility emerges from choke points in raw materials and processing, not just demand. Climate transition. Clean energy goals depend on battery materials concentrated in a few locations, constraining deployment speed. China's structural leverage makes these dynamics systemic, not incidental. Export controls or localized industrial strategies are not arbitrary. They exploit the architecture built over decades by accumulation and entrenchment. The global system is now a network of interdependent industrial arteries. German firms build and embed production inside China. China controls high-value nodes and processing choke points. The US seeks to diversify supply chains, but dependencies persist. The tension is quiet, yet profound. Every contract, facility, and R&D center today shapes global leverage tomorrow. Strategic agility is constrained by decades of industrial accumulation. Reducing dependence is possible, but it requires capital, time, and willingness to endure transitional inefficiencies.